Hi, everyone. Welcome to Week 1, Chapter 1, Intro to Media. This week, we're going to be starting at the very beginning of the book. Some weeks, we'll be going out of order. So next week, I think we're going to be on Chapter 10. Just so you know, it kind of moves around a little because we're taking more of a chronological approach as opposed to the order of the textbook. I'm your instructor, Danielle Ferrari. It's nice to meet you all. Let's get into it. This week is going to be a bit of a longer lecture because it's our first big intro. I try to keep these under 30 minutes in general, but this one's going to be a little bit of a doozy. I apologize. But you feel free to put me on 1.5 or double speed if that makes it easier to get through it. And I recommend having this on kind of maybe while you're looking at your textbook, if that's a way that you can work, so that you're not feeling like you have to kind of do both. If you are a person who likes a revision, then I would start with the textbook and then go to the lecture, but up to you how it works for you. Okay, so what are we going to do in this chapter? We're going to define key concepts and investigate important periods of communication history, which we'll then go into for the first chunk of this semester. We're going to be looking at the kind of how we got here history of media. We're going to learn a little bit about how the digital revolution and media convergence have shaped today's culture, learn some various tools to help us think differently about media and the way that media has been thought about, and address and think about some key issues related to the politics of media representation, and discuss the judgments that we make a little bit about media and reflect on historically specific and politically specific circumstances around media. The most important thing we're doing this week, you want to be getting familiar with this 5-step critical process because it's something we're going to be using throughout the semester. And in case you haven't yet watched the syllabus overview, you're going to be using the critical process in our participation activities for about the first half of this semester, and it is going to be the foundation of all of your writing assignments. So get real comfy with that. I recommend printing it out and even having like a copy around just so you kind of understand the 5 steps as you go through. So this lecture is going to be broken down into a couple of sections of understanding media today, how we got here, culture, technology, and the evolution of media and communication, media in our digital era, thinking differently about media and culture, and media and the politics of culture. And then finally, we're going to get into our media literacy and action in the critical process. This is mirrored in your textbook and how that's organized, which is why I say it might be helpful to have this kind of going as you're going through your textbook. So media, what do we mean when we say media? It is a plural form of medium that expresses all of the different kinds of mediums of communication that we have. A medium, as you see here, has many different definitions, but the one that's most important for us, it is the means by which something is communicated or expressed. So a medium is the kind of tool, the method, the way that communication gets from one person to another, or in the case of mass media, from a small group of people to a large group of people. So expectations for media, understanding the media today, we're going to be looking at the expectations that we have of media. At its best, can help us understand events that affect us. At its worst, it can misrepresent and exploit tragedies. It can create divisions. It can cause further difficulty and suspicion among people. Media literacy is an important aspect for understanding how we're seeing the stories we're seeing, how they're getting to us, who benefits from them, who's creating them, so that we can understand the way that meaning is constructed and be critical as consumers of media, of the products, and also be reflective users of technologies and be thoughtful about how it is we're also producing media we're putting out in the world, for any of you who might actually be content creators. So media literacy is an understanding of mass communication developed through a critical process that enables a person to become more engaged as a citizen and more discerning as a consumer of mass media products. And we'll talk about other kinds of media products as well. Okay, so part 2 of our lecture, part 2 of your textbook, is the how we got here. It's the history of the culture, technology, and evolution of media and communication. We're going to look at that in detail with a few key terms to start with. 2 other key terms for us are communication and culture, and these 2 are intertwined. So communication is the creation and use of symbol systems that convey information and meaning. This includes languages, but it can also include images, sounds, computer code, emojis. Culture is the symbols of expression that individuals, groups, and societies use to make sense of daily life and articulate their values. And it is the process that delivers the values of the society through these kinds of communication products. So culture is the collection or the environment in which communication exists. It is sort of the habitat of communication. And communication is culture dependent. So we know this obviously in language, right, where a language is spoken in one place and in one culture and is not necessarily received in the same way in another place. Spanish is different in Spain than it is in Mexico, than it is in Puerto Rico, right? These are different ways that presumably the same functional parts of communication are used differently dependent on culture. We also see this outside of language spaces in things like emojis, right? So if you are used to communicating in a particular platform that tends to have people from a specific culture in it, whether that's a culture that's like a subculture of a certain kind of people who know and in knowledge, or culture in the sense of an area of the world, it's going to be different from one place to another. Things have different impacts. So culture and communication are always going to be interrelated. Mass media is the industries that produce and distribute songs, video games, movies, novels, and internet services and other cultural products to large numbers of people. That large numbers of people part is the important part, right? So what mass media is specifically, it is unidirectional, right? It means that there is a small group of people, small group of organizations who have power to create and distribute media to all of us. We are on the receiving end of this information, right? So think of it as like a projection, right? Like if you go to a movie, there's a projector, right? So that's one thing that's going out to many, many things. There's no opportunity for you to engage back, and you are not making that content, right? Unless you have been accepted into that system in some way as a creator, as a producer, as a musician, right? But it is essentially unidirectional mass media and is about the systems that control it. Mass media industry is the channels of communication that produce and distribute media products. So again, all of those songs, TVs, whatever, to large groups of people. So we have mass media communication, and then we have the mass media industry. A term that's useful across all eras of media is the concept of affordances. Affordances are features or capabilities of a technology that help establish how we use it. What kind of information does a technology allow us to send, how quickly, in what form, and to whom? So, in other words, an affordance of social media is the ability to talk to and be responded to. An affordance of broadcast media, say news, radio, right, was the ability to be able to reach a lot of people very quickly. So it was an important thing for being able to send out alerts for emergency situations, things like that. So that is an affordance. This is going to be a word that comes up for us across the semester. So eras in early and mass communication. So pre-mass communication and mass communication. Early communication is oral and written. What that means is written in the sense of handwriting on paper, right? This was before you could reproduce a book easily. If you wanted to make a copy, you had to handwrite it, right? So this is our pre-mass communication era. This is oral histories, people telling stories. There are still communities that have a lot of valuable oral history. Oral history continues to exist. So one thing I want you guys to think a little bit about is that we have a tendency in history to think of like, oh, this thing happened then, and then the new thing happened, and that stopped happening. But it isn't really true, right? It's sort of that things kind of get like onioned, right? They build on each other. Oral communication, oral history is still incredibly integral to our current era, even after mass communication, in what we now call like the digital era or mass personal communication, which we'll talk about in a minute. But those aspects of written communication, oral communication continue to live on in the next era, which is our mass communication era. This is when we start having print, the ability to reproduce books, which we'll talk a lot about next week. That's our week looking at the history of the Gutenberg press and the evolution of printings and its impact on society. So just really quickly, we're going to speed through a little bit of what it is that you can expect for us to talk about in the next couple of weeks, because we're going to be doing our historic start off in the course. So we're going to start with the impacts of the printing press. I'm not going to go into huge detail here, but you can take a look at the slide of what it is that this enabled. It was hugely valuable for creating an ability for people to access ideas they didn't have otherwise without having to depend on somebody in power telling them those ideas. Because often people were not literate. Before the printing press, people depended for their information on what they were told by others. And the printing press really revolutionized that and expanded literacy and began to change a lot of things. The electronic era, this is the start of instant communication. This is at the very beginning of being able to not have to wait for a book to be written and then printed and handed around to people, right? This is the ability to turn on a radio and hear what somebody is saying at the moment that they're saying it. And this creates some important things that we're going to talk more about too, like the idea of a mass nation, which is a large percentage of diverse population who had to consume the same kind of media. So the sense that we are all sort of under the same stories, and how that then in turn impacted what was referred to as a consensus narrative, right? That was the idea that there were norms and structures to society that were based largely on the idea that we all got to see the same values reflected in the same culture, because we only got to see such a small percentage, right? And everyone saw it. So that impacted how we understood those things. We'll talk more about these things, obviously, when we do our weeks on these individual eras. And then where we are now is the digital era. And the digital era converts everything into binary code. It also is built on convergence, which is the technological merging of once distinct, incompatible formats into a single format, which is a fancy way of saying I used to only be able to make a phone call on a phone. And now I watch a movie, do my tasks or my homework, and talk to people on the other side of the world. And all of these things happen in one device. But convergence also means that business practice, media companies merge and build greater control through fewer companies. So that means that as you are experiencing your phone as a place to have a million different kinds of things happen, the people who run and control the media companies are also buying up other aspects together. So the convergence is not just right in the material and in our experience, it's in the way that it's owned and operated, creating a lot of almost monopoly-like situations, which we'll talk a lot about when we have our week on media business. This also, on the positive end, creates a lot of expanded representation. So we have a lot less consensus narratives. This is a lot of opportunity to hear different things from different people and see different viewpoints and different values reflected culturally. This also begins to create what's referred to as a niche nation. In other words, targeted media, fragmentation, and the feeling often of a lack of connection among people. At least that's the way this gets understood. We'll talk more about whether or not you guys think those things are true when we get there. So media and culture in our digital age, what makes our era unique? So some important terms for our current moment is mass personal communication. If we think back to mass communication, right, where there's just a few people controlling everything and talking to us as a large group of the citizenry consuming the same media, this is a shift on that, right? This is a method of communication that mixes and matches aspects of mass communication and interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication is like a telephone call, right? That's two people talking to each other. And something like TikTok, right, which allowed people to create video responses to other people's content, just the even ability for individuals to speak directly to each other through an application rather than seeing large-scale media created for a large audience. That is mass personal communication, right? So it's kind of a mix of how we communicate when we have an intimate connection to the person we're talking to, and we're still consuming media, right? You're still like watching media on your phone through a large platform. This new culture where we are able to have a lot of mass personal communication and the kinds of connections that affords us, this is referred to as participatory culture. This term originated with a media scholar named Henry Jenkins, describing a culture in which it's relatively easy for people to create and share their own content and build connections with each other with a lot less barriers than when they were trying to navigate the mass media industry in order to be able to communicate. So related to an idea of a niche nation or this fragmentation is the idea of media environments. So this is a habitat in which we conduct almost every aspect of our daily life. So doing so pushes us to define a wider range of experiences as media experiences. What this means is like, if your phone, in the wake of convergence, if your phone is your alarm and your means of talking to your friends and how you do your homework and how you keep track of your health and fitness or any of these things, it means that media then becomes part of every aspect of our life instead of just when we are intentionally consuming it. Like as if we, for instance, if somebody sits down to watch a film or goes to a movie, that's an isolated experience, where now we see that media companies communicate with us and also, right, take a lot of our data, so take information from us in the ways that we use technology to manage and navigate our relationship to the world around us all the time. Right. So as we said earlier, one of the negatives of this is this idea of a niche nation, or the way that it creates fragmentation or separation, because we have like what's often referred to as siloed communities that we exist in. The algorithm puts us in communication and in connection with people who share our perceptions, values, etc. So we are less likely to have shared touchstones that were available when there was a consensus narrative. Again, consensus narrative is not necessarily a positive thing, and niche nation has a lot of positives that come along with it, but also a lot of negatives, right? There are benefits and negatives to all different eras of media, but certainly one of the problems of niche nation is the idea that people can not understand their own limited perception because they're seeing it reflected always in the people around them, right? And not being able to have access to this great possibility of participatory culture theoretically, right? Of being exposed to new ideas and different people, but instead kind of creating these sort of small siloed communities that actually internally have a lot of consensus narrative, but at a small scale for specific groups. And what this produces, right, is fragmentation as part of our new viewing practices, right? So we seem to have fewer, or at least less powerful consensus narratives. Again, I argue that actually we have a lot of them. They're just very small, and they're not, the consensus group is small, right? If the media we consume offers each other different representations of reality, and we approach a situation without shared facts or values, solving the kinds of problems that democratic societies face is likely to get more difficult, right? What that means in practice is that if we don't have a shared sense of culture amongst each other, it gets a lot harder for us to agree on how to solve problems together. Like, we have different groups with different ideas and different values, and inside those groups, people are very adamantly convinced that their notion of what the solution is the correct one, and don't even necessarily have exposure to other approaches. So in our digital age of mass personal communication, we are all playing three roles in the way that we engage with media. We are media consumers because we read things, watch things, listen to things, look at social media, etc., right? And then media producers as well. You may not feel like you're much of a producer, especially if you're just like, I just kind of like things on social media. I don't post much. But even if we aren't actively putting out things that we think of as media production, we are producing data in what we're looking at. And that itself, whether it's visible to us or not, is of the process of engaging in production. Then we're all also media citizens. So in democratic societies, citizenship comes with expectations of participating in civic life and caring about the common good and events and issues of the moment. So this means the way that we engage with information. So this is a little bit more of how we are responding to and engaging with the information that we receive through media. That is the aspect of being a media citizen. Okay, so part 4, thinking differently about media and culture. In this section, we're looking at how we think about and understand media has changed in different periods of how we've studied it, right? So historical background is a useful tool for analyzing media because it strengthens the ability to analyze media. It helps us with understanding that today's media environment has resulted from choices in the past. And you'll see a lot of this in this first half of the semester when we look a lot at history, and we'll be talking about the impacts of decisions about regulation and how media business was developed in the United States and how that impacts our contemporary media environment. So this helps with seeing the present through fresh eyes. So I know that history isn't always like the most interesting thing to a lot of people, but I really encourage you to really think about the choices that were made, choices that weren't made, and how that's created the worlds that you live in now, and how the choices we're making now are similarly creating a future environment. We used to understand media and study media through a kind of linear model of mass communication, right? So what that means is the linear process of producing and delivering messages to large audiences was how we sort of understood what was being made, how it was being made, and the impacts of it. So that linear model means, right, you have kind of the people who produce and send the messages themselves, the channels they travel through, the people who receive them, and then the gatekeepers who kind of control how that's received on some level, and then feedback. So messages from received senders or gatekeepers. In other words, whatever kind of minimal way that like the audience in a mass media culture have to be able to respond. The linear model isn't without some uses, right? It has some significant values to us. But around the 1960s, 70s, we started to see some pushback on it as not being able to fully understand some of the broader ways that media functions outside of the kind of passive audience in that structure, right? So we started to think about the cultural approach to media versus the linear approach. And in the cultural approach, we have methods for analyzing media that consider elements of the linear model as active parts of complex cultural conditions and processes, right? So it's not so much that it's saying, hey, the linear model is completely wrong. It's saying it's missing these other aspects of how that system works inside of a broader network. So this includes adding more elements to the analysis of the media text. So that's kind of the content, the technologies, and how those specific technologies impact messages, the industries, meaning the people in control, and the structures of those economies and businesses, users. So thinking about audiences, not just as receivers, but as users. And this is a critical difference with the cultural approach, right? Even before we start having mass personal communication, we start thinking about people on the quote unquote receiving end as being more engaged and more active in the way that they relate to media. And then finally, the cultural context. So understanding how media, like we were saying earlier, when thinking about communication and culture and their interaction, how the context itself impacts how all media is received. So this model encourages us to analyze interconnections among these elements. So your book gives you this visual of the interaction between media industries, media text, media users, and media technologies. I don't think it's necessarily visually very helpful to understand how they interact because it's much more of a messy soup than this. And the cultural context is kind of more sort of around and encasing more than it is sort of in the center, but it is also in the center. So anyway, it's maybe not the most helpful visual tool, but it does give you guys a breakdown of what those specific individual aspects of those 5 intersecting parts are. So it's not without value, but it's not the most clear visual tool. Okay, our 5th section is media and the politics of culture. So one of the ways that the cultural approach is important to us and our role as media citizens is that it pushes us to analyze the ways that media and culture serve as sites of political struggle. In order to understand what that means, you guys have to think about politics outside of like political parties. This is thinking about politics as a process by which power, resources, status, rights, visibility, all of those things that define how much mobility we have, how much freedom we have, how much comfort we have, all of those things are articulated through these processes. And that is what is collectively referred to as politics, right? So think about it kind of beyond the realm of electoral politics. For most media companies, they represent reality in a format that makes them money, right? So part of having a political lens and thinking about this is remembering that that's part of what's happening every time we're engaging with media and interrogating media representations in terms of fairness and equity. So what we want to be doing is like bringing to our consumption of media an idea of the motivations behind it, of who's producing it, where they're coming from, and how that fits in this broader political process. And a large part of representing that reality by the terms they understand it means turning events and situations into stories. A big part of what we're going to do across this whole semester is think about narratives and how the stories that we tell and retell in relationship to what we call reality bring about certain kinds of responses and understandings, and how those understandings and stories then impact the way that we make opinions and understand the world around us, right? So, related to this, media stories put events in a context and shape how we understand our daily lives. So, they will refer to and indicate well-known, well-worn stories that you know, right? So, things like good versus evil, David versus Goliath, meaning the little guy and the big guy, right? And power, coming of age, success against great odds, the hero's journey is a big one, right? So, by putting in indicators of things that remind us of narrative structures we're already familiar with as part of our culture, we end up having certain kinds of understandings of social issues or events that are happening through this lens of these narratives. And that impacts how we see ourselves, how we see other people in relationship to the stories that those events are being told through. So I give you guys some examples here. For instance, famously, Katrina, when it was presented in the news, right? Some people were presented as doing what they needed to do in order to survive and were seen as heroes struggling under a difficult situation, versus other people who were doing the exact same things would be cast as criminals, right? So the difference between somebody who's finding resources they need versus somebody who's being accused of looting, right? And how those two castings of the same event impact how we understand the event and how we see the players in that event. So we're going to be looking at the history of the growth of mass media, again, for like the first half of this semester. And we're going to be paying attention to the ways that eras in media history, especially in Western societies, as our book constructs this, right, are characterized by political, economic, and social developments and the cultural values around them. And we're going to be paying a lot of attention to kind of the early modern era and understanding how that built some of the foundational narratives that we are continuing to see even in our contemporary times, right? So things like, or see them being criticized or broken down. So the modern era is defined by things like faith and expertise, nationalism, ideas about progress, the rise of mass communication industries, and a differentiation between good and bad cultural products. So there's a lot of moralizing of what are the correct kinds of media, what are the sort of valued media versus the populist, less valued media. And this is reflected in this model of kind of the culture as skyscraper, right, that your book gives you, that shows that in kind of a modernist thinking model, right, you start seeing this idea that some things are better than others, that the top floors, right, is the good taste stuff. And there's high culture and there's low culture. And low culture is bad and also populist. It's important that this skyscraper is not only about what's at the top, but as the top goes up, it gets smaller, right? So the idea is that wherever something has mass popularity, it is perceived in this historical period to be of less value. And the more elite, the more refined something is, the more rarefied it is, the more valuable it is. This is a big part of modernist thinking. Even though we know that some of the things that kind of have been put up in that top part of this, right, Shakespeare, for instance, started out as a mass populist media product, right? So people used to go to Shakespeare, or commoners, right? This was a popular form of entertainment, not unlike, say, wrestling or something today, where there was food sold in the aisles. It was loud. It was rowdy. There were people who walked through the aisles and splattered people with blood during fight scenes in Shakespearean play. So the fact that it has become elitist and rarefied has a lot to do with the fact that it is consumed by less and less people, right? So this is something to think about in how modern thought, modernity, which we are no longer in, right, up until the 1950s, perceived value and culture inside systems of value. So again, modern era views culture as hierarchy, That hierarchy resulted from specific political contexts, threats to social elites from a growing world working class and immigrant populations, and increasing access to more media, right? So part of this is a response to the fact that mass media is reaching more people. This grew out of the increased literacy that came from books, the increased regular reading and access to news that came from inexpensive newspapers. And so people pushed back on this by determining that only those things which were specialized and available to a small group of people was seen to be valuable in media. And other things were seen to be dangerous, problematic, less valuable. And we'll see that repeat through all of these different phases of media that we're going to talk about in the first half of the semester. So then we get into the postmodern era, the 1950s to the present. Arguably, we are in like post, but as far as our book is concerned, it's postmodern. And what's characterized postmodernity is a growing skepticism about expertise and the ideas of progress, the notion that like things are always on a trajectory of improvement, or that the things that are happening are in the pursuit of progress, right? There's more of a criticism that says, hey, wait, maybe these things are actually not improving things for everyone or for most people. And so ideas about progress start being challenged in different ways. And the role of media has a big shift in the postmodern era. You see a decline in traditional authority figures over like informal media. So we start to have criticisms of hierarchies, but they also still kind of persist at the same time. We have changing relationships between norms around mass culture. Again, when we think about something like niche nation growing out of consensus narratives, this is a big part of what defines the postmodern era, right, is the breakdown of consensus narratives too. On a positive note, it's an idea that we're starting to see things like breaking down hierarchized values of what is conceived of as important, or, sorry, I had hiccups, as in what's important or what's considered valuable in culture, right? So we start thinking about a much more horizontal approach to thinking about culture as part of an ongoing complicated process that we all participate in, and we kind of take things from all different parts of culture, things that would be determined to be high value, but then are also part of much more accessible popular culture, and seeing that those things don't necessarily have any formal differentiation among them, right? Personal taste starts to become more important. It's less formalized and there's less consensus around it. There's more differentiation and diversity in people's tastes. Okay, so we're now in our final part. This is media literacy. We're going to run through this super fast because I know this is a long lecture and I'm not trying to keep you guys forever. But media literacy in action, our critical approach. This is going to be the nuts and bolts of how we're going to think about things and talk about things through the majority of this semester. And like I said, the first half of this semester, I'm going to have you guys really look at this and practice doing it a lot in our participation activities. And I know that's going to be boring. I promise it's not boring, but it's repetitive. And I know that that's not always people's favorite thing, but I promise in the latter half of the semester, you're going to have a little bit more freedom in your participation activities. But I want you guys to get really versed in this 5-step process so that you're bringing this into your writing practices and thinking about it all the time. This should be kind of like background noise to you whenever you're engaging in media. So the 5 steps are description. You're always going to be looking to describe exactly what you're seeing. This is just taking note of what it is you're seeing. This can be anything from, okay, I'm noticing that they use this really big swelling music when they're talking about something that is supposed to be of importance and it has a kind of emotional impact, right? Like, it's designed to give me some kind of feeling. And the analysis is like, okay, so what is that feeling that they might be doing that with? Looking at how does that pattern reappear? When do they use that kind of music? Who's using that kind of music? For what purposes, right? The interpretation is, what does that mean, right? What does this do? And the evaluation is arriving at a judgment about whether we think something is good or bad or mediocre. And that's not just opinion evaluation. That's a little bit more looking at like the wider cultural value of the media itself. Is it doing what it's trying to do? Is what it's trying to do valuable? Is it something that I think is good or bad or important? How am I experiencing that? And yes, still, do I like it? Do I enjoy this? Is this something that is effective as a form of media to me, right? And then engagement is us kind of taking on that media citizen role, right? Of thinking about what it means to be consuming the kind of media we're looking at in the system that it exists in. Is there any way that we want to push back on it or engage with it further or possibly spread information about it to other people, right? This is the concept of that kind of understanding. So thanks for getting through our first chapter. Don't forget to do those achievement quizzes and the participation activity. There's an orientation achievement activity to get you guys used to it too. So don't forget that one. And let me know if you have any additional questions about the chapter, or anything we covered, or anything about the class. I'm looking forward to hearing from you guys and meeting all of you in the introduction participation this week. So tell me who you are, why you're in this class, all of those fun things. Email me through the platform if you need anything, and I will have our first office hours on our first day on Tuesday if anybody needs them, instead of our usual Monday 5 to 6. So if you're seeing this and you want to come say hi, I will be there. Otherwise, I'll do it Monday again before this first week closes if you have any questions about assignments. Have a great week. Glad that you're here. Happy spring semester. Bye.